Hello and welcome to a new episode here at the Wars Rebellion podcast for Age War. I'm your host, Niels Eichhorn, and today I am again joined by my partner in France, Andrew Hauk, who, despite personal health difficulties, has decided to still be here and enjoys this wonderful hour and a half or so that we have ahead of us because we have again, special guest today. We have a anniversary edition. And if you have lived under a rock about 20 years ago, you probably didn't realize it came out, but it is a really important book that we're going to discuss today. And with us is Nicole Etcheson. She got her PhD from Indiana University and is currently a professor of history at Ball State University, also in Indiana. But don't worry, she has left the state a few times in the past. And she's also a really accomplished author with the first book, The Emerging Midwest, published in 96, and then also A Generation at War, the Civil War era in a Northern Community in 2011. But of course, today we're going to talk about the important big one, Bleeding Kansas, Contested Liberty in the Civil War, which came out in 2004. So first of all, thank you so much, Nicole, for joining us today. And I'll let Andrew ask the first question today.
Hi there, Nicole. It's nice to see you. So we were talking earlier about the origin story of your Bleeding Kansas book, and where did it come from? How did you
Yes,
get on
well,
the topic of Bleeding Kansas?
thank you so much for having me and treating the book like a major milestone whose anniversary has to be celebrated. That's really great honor. The Bleeding Kansas book came out of when I was researching my dissertation at IU, which became A Generation at War. And I was reading all these letters, manuscripts from Hoosiers, and also people in Illinois and Ohio, because that book was about those states as well. But I noticed that when I got to the 1850s, everybody was talking about Bleeding Kansas, and a lot of people were going there. They were going out to Kansas territory to get a farm, but they were aware of the controversy over Kansas territory, and so that seemed kind of interesting to me. Then as I finished up the Emerging Midwest, I started digging around, and a lot of the literature on Bleeding Kansas was pretty old. Alice Nichols had published her book in 1954. Um, James Raleigh had published a book in, I think, the late 60s. So the literature seemed a little dated, and I thought, well, I'll go back and look at this and see if there's something I can do. You know, historians are always looking for something that hasn't been done or that can be done in a new way, and that seemed like a possibility.
Okay.
Wow. So that I expected like a punchline there in some form. Like, oh, I came across this archive in the attic of somebody in Kansas that no one had seen before.
No, people always, ask, did you find some new sources, like, some new document about Abraham Lincoln? And but I think most of the stuff in 19th century US history we know it. Some occasionally something turns up. But it's really more about approaching things from a new perspective.
Right. So I'm going to ask
And
you to, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, and the new perspective was I felt that a lot of the literature on Bleeding Kansas treated the characters, the people, as sort of comical figures. And it is true that, I mean, you've got John Brown, you've got Jim Lane, you've got Charles Robert, you've got all these very extraordinary personalities running around Kansas Territory doing this stuff. So it's kind of easy to make fun of them a little bit or treat it not terribly seriously, but it really was very serious.
I mean, you can feel the caricature side of these people you're talking about, and I think with the illustrations that you share, the engravings, you really get the humor,
Yeah, well, yeah, well, you've got somebody like Jim Lane, and in the photographs, his hair is always standing up and it looks really wild, and he looks a little bit wild-eyed, and he is somebody who it is easy to make fun of, but he had a very powerful impact on the shape of the Free State movement, because the Free State movement was this alliance between these New Englanders who were more inclined to be anti-slavery and the Midwesterners. And Lane was from Indiana. A lot of the settlers were from Indiana. And he had been he'd been a congressman from Southern Indiana. And he was a very charismatic orator, fiery kind of orator, who we would probably, snicker and think this is really, it was over the top. It really was over the top. But people followed him and people believed in him. And he had a very powerful political impact in the territory.
Yeah. And well, I kind of want to start also with sort of a little bit of because it is a reflection in many ways of what you wrote, but also sort of a opportunity to kind of look back and see like what the impact is that you had on sort of the writing. So Andrew and I talked earlier today, and one of the things that I was curious about is sort of like how do you see your book appear in sort of textbooks, like textbooks for like the U.S. History Survey, but also textbooks like for the Civil War era? Do you see like the narratives that you have produced in Bleeding Kansas reappear?
I haven't really thought about that. I do think that the book is considered kind of the standard overview narrative, that when you talk about Bleeding Kansas, people come back to it as the foundation for what later studies will talk about. I guess that's the way in which I think about it.
Yeah.
I have a bone to pick.
Okay.
Oh, whoa.
Yeah, it's terrible. It's a terrible thing. I'm not a specialist in Bleeding Kansas by any means. And I had some ideas, basic undergrad ideas, graduate school ideas, basic stuff. But not, I'd never really delved into the subject very much. So the bone I have to pick is that you have shown how complicated Bleeding Kansas, the story of Bleeding Kansas was. I mean, it's how many governors, and were the Free Soil people, what was the term liberty? What did liberty mean? What did democracy mean? Yeah, anyway, so this completely scrambled all of my preconceived notions about Bleeding Kansas.
Okay.
And I guess it's a bone to pick, but it's actually a thank you, because I learned a lot. So
yeah, and I think that was, well, two things maybe in the literature before my book. One was, one of the ways in which people sort of didn't treat Bleeding Kansas seriously was, why are they fighting about slavery when there are no African Americans out in the territory? How can this? So it's sort of like this is kind of ridiculous. So we can't really take this seriously. And then, of course, one of the big issues that I continue fighting to this day is is all John Brown. You know,
Yeah.
everybody gives John Brown the credit. And of course, in Topeka and in the state capitol, you've got the John Stewart Curry mural with Brown, you know, like a Christ figure with his arms spread out, and he's towering over everything else. And so when people have maybe, Andrew, what you call a sort of simplified version of Bleeding Kansas, it's John Brown came out there and it was all about him. And one of the things I really wanted to emphasize, Brown's really a marginal figure. And he is important in that the murders at Potawatomi take the conflict in a direction that the Free Staters really did not want it to go, many of them. He's a catalyst, and then he goes on to Harper's Ferry, and that has great impact on the coming of the Civil War. But a lot of people, all they know about Bleeding Kansas is John Brown, and the Free State Movement was not John Brown. He wasn't even a member of it, and it's far more complicated than that.
Well, sorry. So did you find that when you were putting this book together, that you were in some ways kind of responding to or reacting to Ken Burns?
No,
Because
I didn't think about Ken Burns at all.
Really? Okay.
I mean, I of course saw the Ken Burns documentary when it came out. I was in grad school and I watched the whole thing, and I was already interested in 19th century U.S. history, but of course it created this big kind of flourishing of interest in the Civil War and the publications of a lot of soldiers' diaries. But I can't say that I thought about the Ken Burns Civil War documentary at all.
Well, the reason I ask is because essentially what this book does for me is it tears apart the kind of the setting up of the Civil War in Harper's Ferry with Bleeding Kansas that Ken Burns does in the beginning of that series, which, as you said as well, simplifies the story and boils it down to John Brown, and that's as far as it goes, which I think is a shame given how intensely complicated the story actually was.
Well, yes, and I think the reason we boil it down to John Brown is it is so complicated, and even in my Civil War classes, or certainly in the survey class, it's like you talk about all the changing governors. I don't even get into the governors because it's bad enough that, okay, we got two different territorial governments, and one's recognized by the federal government, but it's elected fraudulently. And the other one has no legal authority, but it's the one that probably better represents the territorial settlers of Kansas. You got two, and then you get into Lecompton, which is, okay, we have not just all the governors, but all the proposed constitutions. You got the Topeka Constitution, you got the Lecompton Constitution, you got Mineola. So there's all these different constitutional conventions. But even just explaining Lecompton, that you get a constitutional convention elected that the Free Staters don't take part in. So it's pro-slavery, and it submits a constitution. But there's a provision that you can vote for Lecompton, with slavery or without slavery. But without slavery means no future slave. I mean, try explaining that to freshmen. So even though it is, Lecompton is really important as a catalyst to the Civil War, because it's this point where Southerners in Congress say it was a pro-slavery cut. They voted to have Kansas come in as a slave state, and and Congress blocked it. The Northerners in Congress blocked it and didn't happen. So we were cheated. And President Buchanan says Lecompton was the legal result of a legal process. And this contributes to Southern disaffection from the North in the run up to the Civil War. It's also the case that at Lecompton, of course, is the famous point where Senator Stephen Douglas breaks with the president, says, no, I'm not going to support this pro-slavery constitution because that is not popular sovereignty. And that helps explain why when we get into the 1860 Democratic Convention, white Southerners are like, no way we will have Douglas for our candidate. They refuse to support Douglas and then break up the Democratic Party. Okay, so Lecompton's very important in various different ways to the coming of the Civil War, but it's so complicated to explain that I have found myself sometimes just skipping it. Or sometimes I just say, okay, we have one of these mixed up elections in Kansas, so we get a pro-slavery constitution presented to Congress. And don't ask about the details because it's way too complicated to try and get in that part about white Southerners are unhappy they don't get Kansas as a slave state in 1858. And they're mad at Stephen Douglas because he doesn't support Kansas coming in under Lecompton. But it's just much easier to say John Brown killed people in Kansas and then he went to Harper's Ferry and killed more people, and white Southerners we can't trust the North. And that's what brings on the Civil War.
Well, we might all end up having to teach that soon. I will say, though, I do, when I still taught the U.S. survey in sort of the traditional kind of fashion, I did talk about Bleeding Kansas, I did talk about Lecompton, and I always did it in the way of the votes, right? McGee County and Oxford County, like, this is how many people lived there. This is how many votes were cast, to kind of drive home to the students like how fraudulent these elections were. And then like the numbers for like this is the people who voted in this one referendum supporting Lecompton. Here's the people that voted against Lecompton. And now Congress can decide which one do they want.
Famous actors and presidents and all sorts of famous people voting for
right
on the voting registry.
Cincinnati city directory.
Yeah, that's fun. That's a fun detail.
Yeah, and I tell the students the voters managed at Oxford and McGee to sign in alphabetically.
I mean, it's amazing, right?
Voted in alphabetical order, just copying the names out of the Cincinnati directory.
So how did you discover that it was it already well known that it was the Cincinnati directory, or did you find that?
Oh, I think that's fairly well known.
Okay.
Right. Yeah, because I pulled that. I think I pulled my numbers from Freeling's Road to Disunion, and that came out like 5 years before your book, 6 years before your book's the first volume.
The first volume, yeah, definitely.
Oh no, that was the second volume. That would have been the second volume.
Second volume, I think, came out after my book because I was on a panel with Bill Freeling.
Yeah, I don't remember. I think it was.
Yeah.
No, but it's. I mean, it goes back to this larger question that is at the heart of some of the struggles you have of this territory is supposed to be the pinnacle of popular sovereignty.
Yes.
And every election is exactly the opposite of that.
Yes. And I think the numbers that I use particularly are that first March 1855 election of the territorial legislature, where we have the census, and the census says there are 2,905 eligible voters in Kansas Territory, and the pro-slavery party is winning the elections with majorities of 5,000 or 6,000 votes. So clearly something's funny going on here, and then you just continue to have this throughout the period until you get to 1858 and new territorial governor, and really it was the lieutenant governor who throws out the fraudulent returns, and you get a free staters elected to the territorial legislature. Yeah, and this was, this book came out, and I was working on it right around the time of the 2000 election. And so now we are in, since 2000, we've had a very good sense that the democratic processes don't always work smoothly. Just the mechanisms. You get hanging chads, you get machines that don't work. But at the time the book came out, that was just really, you had elections, and there was not a lot of controversy on how the votes were counted. So at the time, the book did sort of highlight fraud and issues in elections that Americans hadn't thought about for generations.
I
And
guess
now we're thinking about all the time.
Yeah, I was gonna say it's like it feels interesting when you look back, like right in the last 8 years, right? Of like, oh, fraud in election. It has become the conversation.
Yeah. And I mean, what you had in the 1850s was genuine fraud, and genuinely trying to. I think what we've had a lot in the United States is a lot of talk about fraud, that when there are there are, I'm here in Muncie, Indiana, and we had a city councilman who lost his seat because of absentee ballot fraud. So it really does happen. He was filling out absentee ballots for elderly people, which you are not supposed to do. finally state caught up with him. But then we have preoccupations with other kinds of fraud. Andrew may know this, but Indiana pioneered in the voting ID. Many states, Indiana, Kansas, you have to show your driver's license in order to vote. And this was something Indiana pioneered to stop in-person voting fraud, which is extremely rare. And when that was argued in front of the United States Supreme Court, one of the justices asked the state of Indiana, so how many cases of in-person voter fraud do you have? And the state's answer was none that we know of.
One in 1820. One in 1820.
Yeah. But the state passed this, and many other states have passed this. So,
so like final follow-up, and then I hand it over to Andrew too. I'm feeling like I'm dominating today.
No, these are good questions. I mean,
no, but
I kind of sit back and relax, enjoying conversation. This is great.
Anyways, we're all 19th century historian, and we all know how elections in the 19th, especially mid-19th century in the US go, right? Like especially Reconstruction, Southern elections, Baltimore. I mean, you name it, New York, right? Tammany Hall and everything. So how unusual was the level of fraud that you saw in Kansas? Was it like extraordinarily outrageous, or just common for this period?
Well, and that's a good question, because I want to address that in fairness to the Missourians, because of course it's the Missourians who are committing this. They are crossing over the river. They are voting when they are technically not resident in the territory. They are voting more than once. They are threatening the Free Staters, particularly the spring of 1855, in that first major election. a lot of the problem was that the people from Indiana or Iowa who had come into the territory were threatened and asked how they were going to vote, and the Missourians were armed and they were drinking, and that was common particularly at Western and Southern elections. It was the George Caleb Bingham, the county election painting, where it's all male. There's a guy who's so drunk he's falling over. An enslaved person who's serving drinks to somebody else. So these elections were raucous. There were fights, and there was a lot of drinking. The candidates are treating the voters. So and it was also the other thing. The point I want to make is that particularly on the Western frontier, it's very common to come in on the day of the election and vote because you've just moved to the territory. There aren't any residency requirements. And in fact, there are free staters who show up in Lawrence on the March 30th, 1855 election and are taken to the polls to vote. So it's not just the Missourians who aren't respecting the residency requirements. In 1855, the requirement was that you were supposed to be a resident of the territory when you voted. So people will come in on that day and say, hey, I'm resident here today, and I might stay or I might not. But they didn't have these stiff residency requirements. So I have always argued that the Missourians don't do anything that isn't happening particularly in frontier elections. And in fact, if you look at the congressional testimony about that election, when the congressional committee comes and takes testimony on what happened, and a lot of the Missourians will just say, well, this is what we did back in Kentucky. I don't see what the big deal is about. This is the way elections are. The free staters make a big deal about the violation of the sanctity of the elections. And I do not know. I suspect that elections are maybe calmer in New England, maybe more sedate, and that there may be an element of genuine shock at how violent and drunken and all this it was. But I also suspect that there's a certain amount of propaganda here in that, the election was, so wild and we were threatened, and all this righteous indignation is a little bit exaggerated because they're making their political point that they've been denied the right to vote.
So 1850s, so 52, 56 Democrats are elected as president, Pierce and Buchanan. How important would you say Bleeding Kansas was in the grand scheme of things for the 56 election?
Well, it was so important that one of these territorial governors, John Geary, he's dispatched out there to make sure that the Democrats win the election. To go back a little bit, 1854, popular sovereignty and the Kansas and Nebraska Act, that's the Democrats. That's all their big idea. Kansas territory is the northern part of the Louisiana Purchase. It's north of the 3630 line. It is not supposed to have slavery. And so when Stephen Douglas gets the Kansas and Nebraska Act passed, he has upset the apple cart. He's introduced this idea that, okay, slavery can go in there. It'll be popular sovereignty. Let the people decide. That's the great American way, Douglas says. And when that doesn't work out smoothly, when you get these elections where Congress is coming to investigate them, And I guess the thing I should say about, the Missourians come over and they vote. And as I said, they don't do anything that maybe they hadn't done on other places on the Western frontier, like Kentucky, but they did it with the whole country watching. Everybody is looking in 1855 to see what happens in Kansas territory, how this popular sovereignty thing works. And so when it is a mess, and you do get these two separate governments, when you have the pro-slavery party takes control of the territorial legislature, but on top of these election results that are obviously questionable, and then you have the New Englanders and the Midwestern settlers who say, okay, we going to form our own government. This is a bogus territorial legislature. It's not legitimate. We're going to go over here and do our own thing. And you're setting up for clash. And you have weak territorial governors. Wilson Shannon, who is there in the summer of early in 1856, is basically an alcoholic, and he was a fairly inept Ohio politician even before he got out to Kansas territory. So you don't, Andrew Reeder, the first territorial governor, essentially went over to the Free State side. Then you get Shannon, who is basically incompetent. So Kansas is turning, into a mess. And April, May of 1856, as you know, Charles Sumner gives his big oration in the Senate, The Crime Against Kansas, and goes on for something like 6 hours about everything that the Democrats have done wrong in Kansas. And the fighting hasn't even started yet. He can do this whole lengthy oration about how the Democrats have messed up. Kansas isn't even fighting yet. We're just talking about the mixed up elections of 1854 and 1855, the Wakarusa War in the winter of 1855, early 1856. I mean, a lot of the material, the Potawatomi Massacre, the suppression of the Free State Legislature in the summer of 1850. There are whole swaths of bad things that haven't yet happened in Kansas. So Sumner's already got all of this material. Then the fighting breaks out. And so, as I said, the Pierce administration finally turns to John Geary, and he was a veteran of the Mexican War. He was Gold Rush mayor of San Francisco. He's a huge guy. He's 6'4" or something. He'll go on to be a Civil War general. And Geary writes in his letters, he knows his job is to go out there, settle things down in Kansas so that Buchanan can get elected president. So obviously the Democratic Party considered Kansas very important, and the new Republican Party, I mean, this is their propaganda. They're the ones who are touting this story of bleeding Kansas because it is an indictment of the Democratic administration.
Kind of a follow-up. Niels, do you mind if I ask another question?
Yeah, go ahead.
And this is not in the book, but it's kind of I saw a couple of references to the Crimean War.
Yes.
So it got me thinking about technology. Was the fact that that there was more widespread access to the information, to the news coming from Kansas, did that amplify things?
Yes, and they do refer to Crimea, and the Free Staters in particular. When Lawrence is under siege, they will send out. You will see in the Republican newspapers these articles about what's happening to Lawrence, Kansas, the Sebastopol, of the West. So they make these references to the Crimean War, and that's probably a topic that that somebody could do some research on, the way the Crimean War is used in the context of Bleeding Kansas. I just know that there were, these references to it.
Well, that
Yeah.
and the Reign of Terror. You can't forget the Reign of
Yeah.
Terror.
Yeah.
Sorry, just got to get the French
Nun, of course.
Best of all, Reign of Terror. So the French side of things. Sorry. Anyway, continue. Sorry.
But as for the news getting back and forth, I mean, there's a bit of a delay. And Robert McGlone, if you know his book, John Brown's War Against Slavery, he goes and very kind of meticulously tracks everything. And so, for example, I mentioned Sumner. We know, John Brown is down there in southern Kansas, and Lawrence is under siege in May of 1856, and Brown and his party are on their way to try and help relieve the siege of Lawrence. And they find out before they get there that Lawrence has been, what the Republican newspapers will call, sacked, has been attacked. The attack is a lot less devastating than calling it a sack makes it sound. But Brown knows about what's happening in Lawrence, and then there's been this controversy or question about whether he knows about the attack on Charles Sumner. Charles Sumner has been caned in the U.S. Senate, and McGlone goes and tracks, how the telegraph operates and time turnarounds and all this, and basically concludes that Brown and his party, they know about Lawrence, but they don't know about Sumner.
Okay. And then that got me to thinking when was it Reeder who escaped and made his way
Yes.
back through Illinois, Detroit, and then on his way to Washington? Would the news of his would his account of what was happening in Kansas have arrived in Washington considerably faster than he did?
Probably. With it, and I don't know absolutely, but if you got to a telegraph station and relayed that,
because
that news is going to get there a lot faster than
within a couple of days, as opposed to a few weeks.
Yeah.
That was my.
Yeah, no. It's interesting. I did not expect to see the Crimean War coming to this.
Hey,
I did enjoy the comments that were in the book with regard to it, and I made some margin notes on that. But I'm not going to research that. That's not.
Me neither.
I don't have the time for that. So some underground.
But it would be it'd be a fantastic book. I mean, it really would be, or at least an article. I mean,
yeah. I think in general, like thinking of Crimean. We only have like one or two books of the United States in the Crimean War, and
yes,
so there's definitely a market for something on that.
Especially because people knew about it and they followed what was happening, and then it marked their their memories.
Oh, certainly, yeah. And just the kind of technology that's in it, right? Gosh, so many possibilities of direction here. So let's I'm going to take this from the governors up to Buchanan. So you already gave us some judgment calls on the different governors, of whom there were 6, if I remember correctly.
Right.
So
6 official governors.
I think there's only official governors. They're all Washington appointed.
Well, I mean, Charles Robinson was the Free State
governor.
The
peak for the peak government. Yeah.
So who was the worst one?
Probably Shannon.
Oh, yeah. That was a drunk, right?
Yeah, he definitely was way in over his head, and mishandled the conflict in the winter of 1855-1856. When the first time the Missourians come and surround Lawrence. And then Shannon goes back in summer 1856. He goes back to DC, and so then Daniel Woodson is the sort of interim governor, and he is very, very, very pro-slavery. He is.
Is he the really short guy? Is he the one who's barely 5 feet tall?
I don't know.
One of the people you talk
That's
about.
a Napoleon complex, I think, that's coming out
There
with
was
the
a person
French
who's
there.
5'1" or 5'2" something.
Yeah,
in contrast to Geary, who's
Gary,
towering
Gary,
above everybody else.
Remember, yeah, it's a very big guy. No, I don't know. I mean, what I remember about Woodson is that he was very flagrantly favoring the pro-slavery side. And so when and he's the one who orders the military to suppress the meeting of the Topeka legislature in the summer of 1856. And then what they do is throws the military under the bus, essentially. That the Colonel Sumner, Edwin Sumner, I think he's a sort of distant relative of Charles Sumner, but Colonel Sumner is the one who goes in to Topeka and tells the Free Staters that they can't meet, which the Free Staters then present as, that they've been disbanded at the point of a bayonet, to make it that the military is being used to oppress them. And Woodson and the Pierce administration kind of go along with that narrative. So then kind of what is happening as things deteriorate in Kansas territory is you got the military there, you got the U.S. Army there. They were very reluctant to cooperate with Shannon because they perceived him as weak and unreliable. And then they cooperated with Woodson and they became the bad guys. So one of the things that Geary, I think, does successfully is Geary acts even-handedly against both the pro-slavery and the Free State side. And by the time Geary arrives in the territory, he gets there in September of 1856. So there's been fighting going on since May, but Geary is very clear that any armed bands, he doesn't care which side they're on, he's going to suppress them. And the military trusts this guy. He's not going to just sell them out. So he's able to work with the army in a way that earlier governors, particularly Shannon, Woodson, had not. And so Geary is a much stronger figure who is successful in restoring order. He drives the armed bands out. Jim Lane disbands. John Brown leaves the territory. Henry Clay Titus goes to Nicaragua, one of the pro-slavery fighters. So Geary's very successful.
You talk about the three-cornered war as well, between you got the free staters, the pro-slavery, and then the U.S. Army.
Yes.
In the territory, kind of maintaining a strange balance of equilibrium of a Cold War. I don't know.
Well,
mutually assured destruction.
Well, this is where Brown is problematic, because the Free Staters, part of their philosophy is they present themselves as the oppressed party. They're the ones who are the victims of the voter fraud. They're the ones that are victims of the violence. So the attack on Lawrence in May of 1856. And Charles Robinson, who's one of the Free State leaders, is always trying to hold the hotheads back. And Lane, because he had experience in the war with Mexico, is sort of the Free State military leader. But Robinson and a lot of the Free Staters are, the federal government already calls us treasonous because we say we're not going to obey the pro-slavery territorial legislature. We cannot afford to do anything that brings the full force of the federal government down on top of us. We can't give them any excuse. So the Free Staters, I don't know, this comparison is a very good one, but it's kind of like nonviolent resistance. And that's an imperfect comparison because the Free Staters are armed and they do have a military wing led by James Lane, but they are trying to be very careful in using violence for fear of bringing the Free State government down on them. They need to portray themselves as the victims of the evil pro-slavery guys. And nobody really wants to tackle the U.S. Army. So part of the reason that you have this confusion and this fighting between pro-slavery and Free State parties in the summer of 1856 is because the Army's standing off there and letting it happen. And you read again the messages from Woodson and Shannon before him to the military officers saying, hey, I need your help. And these officers are like, yes, I will consider your request. I have to consult. I mean, they're stalling. They don't want any part of dealing with these guys. And when Geary comes in and says, okay, I need you to do this, as I said, they trust Geary to support them. And so, yeah, when the military comes out and starts breaking up these bands, then that's what does it. So you can say it's a three-cornered war, but it's really pro-slavery, Free State bands against each other, and the military on the sidelines. And as soon as the military comes into it, all of these guerrilla bands are like, oh, we don't want to deal with these guys. We're going home.
Well, it's also
getting out of territory.
And then the fact that even though numerous people were arrested indicted for treason, they never got a treason count to stick.
Yeah, that's part of what makes it seem kind of comic that Charles Robinson gets arrested for treason, John Brown Jr. gets arrested, and you have this and since we want to have the French angle, they're being held in a camp, and it's the Bastille on the prairie.
I forgot about that. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, that's what they call it. Sarah Robinson, Charles Robinson's wife, is writing all these. She's a major propagandist for the Free State cause, and so she's writing these things about the Bastille. And actually, they're seeing their families. There was some cruelty. John Brown Jr. famously was in shackles and marched through the heat and the dust. But once they're under guard, it's fairly open. People are coming to visit them. And then the Pierce administration tries them for treason and for usurping office. And Charles Robinson is tried on the grounds that he had claimed under this Free State Topeka Constitution to be the governor of Kansas State, because they were saying that Kansas, the Free Staters had decided it's a state. And so the legal wrinkle is, how can you usurp an office that doesn't exist? Federal government says Kansas is a territory, not a state. So he claimed to be governor of something that doesn't exist. So that doesn't go anywhere, and they drop the other cases. But this is all part of Free State propaganda and Republican propaganda in the summer of 1856. The Pierce administration is oppressing the Free Staters.
Crazy.
I'm kind of dominating the questions. So Niels, go ahead.
No, actually, I was going to go back one answer because of the U.S. Army angle. Because I'm like after the Civil War, I can think of like all these strikes that the U.S. military gets involved in against other white people. But I'm kind of like I'm a little hard pressed before the Civil War. Is there ever an instance where the U.S. Army, outside of an international war like the war with Mexico or the war against the British, actually fights or engages in kind of riot suppression against white people?
Oh, I was going to say, well, you got the Indian Wars. They
Yeah,
certainly fought the
yeah.
Seminole and all that. The Utah War,
Oh yeah,
1857.
yeah, of course.
Yeah, that's the biggest military expedition between the Mexican War and the Civil War.
Right.
And I don't know, this is sort of off track. Did you see this new Netflix series, American Primeval? What was the name? Yeah. That sort of starts with the Mountain Meadows massacre, but totally wrong.
Benjamin Park talked about that on Blue Sky. He gave a pretty good rundown with a blog post.
Yeah.
I thought about that as well. You were talking about that.
Yeah, I watched that and I thought, well, it's clearly supposed to be the Mountain Meadows massacre, but this is nothing like what actually happened.
Well, you have to look that up now.
Yeah, and then
it's an interesting watch, but it's you need to make sure that it is a work of fiction.
Yeah.
And I got out a map because Brigham Young kept going to the trading post. Now I'm forgetting the name of the trading post. All during the series, Brigham Young keeps popping up at the trading post. And I finally looked it up, and it's hundreds of miles. I thought there's no way from Salt Lake City to.
And then did you notice that they used the term Sevastopol for the fort that they decided to burn and destroy at the end, so nobody could use it?
Yeah, that's the trading post. I'm trying to remember.
Yeah, so the Crimean War again, and it's even used in the series.
Yeah.
Well, like
I didn't notice that. I just started thinking about. I don't think Brigham Young was traveling all that way.
It was Wyoming, from Wyoming to Utah. I mean, that was a long. That was a long trek.
Yeah.
Oh, Hollywood.
So, this is kind of showing my lack of knowledge. Both Pierce and Buchanan were single-term presidents. Pierce had, all sorts of family issues. He's an alcoholic. His son had been killed. Was what was happening in Kansas one of the potential reasons that he decided not to run for re-election, or was he even tapped to run again, to run for a second
time? I don't think he was tapped to run again. They needed the Democrats in 1856. The reason, one of the reasons that they picked Buchanan is that Buchanan had been out of the country. He'd been minister to Great Britain during this. So, Pierce had presided over this mess. Stephen Douglas, who of course is very ambitious for the presidency, is the author of Kansas-Nebraska Act that's laid the grounds for this whole thing. So Buchanan had the advantage that he'd been out of the country, and even though he supports the party platform in 1856, which is popular sovereignty, non-intervention with slavery in the territories, he's not personally responsible for any of this. So going with Buchanan is the Democrats kind of distancing themselves a little bit from the mess.
So, and then a follow-up question about that. You don't mention, I don't think, in the book the term dough face, for Pierce
Yeah.
or Buchanan. Now, was that applied to anybody else?
Well, I got into a debate with an editor
No.
years ago. Just an article that I wrote for a collection, and it was about the article was about Douglas and Buchanan, and I called Douglas a doughface, and the editor didn't like that and said I needed a citation for that. I needed, so I dug around, I got a citation, and then it was just that he didn't think Douglas was a doughface, so he was going to let me call Douglas a doughface. And like, could have saved me some trouble and just said, you don't care whether I find the evidence, you just don't like that.
Don't want that in there.
Yeah. Buchanan was much more of a doughface than Douglas. Douglas does get a spine during the Lecompton crisis. There's a point at which Douglas isn't going to be, pushed. And he really does adopt popular sovereignty as his mantra, and he can't square the whole messy business of the elections over Lecompton and Lecompton with slavery and without slavery with popular sovereignty. And it's also the case that Northern Democrats in 1858 are just saying their constituents are not going to stand this anymore. And Douglas has to come up for re-election in Illinois in 1858. So there are political reasons, and I think there are also ideological reasons for the break. So I think Douglas is a doughface in the sense that he really had no understanding of the moral and ideological objections to enslavement. And he was, by virtue of his first marriage, essentially the owner of a plantation in Mississippi. And Jim Houston's short biography of Douglas, essentially this is where Douglas is getting his income in the 1850s, is the proceeds of enslaved labor from his first wife's inheritance that she had died and left to their sons. So he's very oriented in the South. He's rooted in the South, and I always see Douglas as someone who not only doesn't have any objections to slavery, but doesn't understand other people's objections. I think Douglas fundamentally saw Christians who believed that slavery was a sin as faking it. This couldn't be a real sentiment.
Well, since we're on Buchanan, let's stick with him for a minute, because I just looked it up, because Buchanan is universally ranked as the worst president, even though I think we'll change that pretty soon. And Andrew, of course, your guy, Andrew Johnson, is ranked as the second worst president, and then Franklin Pierce is number 3 in the bottom tier.
Yeah, I got the bottom 3 now.
Yeah, it's well, wait a few years. Donald Trump will be down there. It's bottom soon. But I was more thinking in terms of, like, considering the situation that Buchanan is in, right? It's like there's pressures from all sides. And obviously we're ranking him in large part badly because of what happens in the last few months of his administration. What could have Buchanan done differently? That, like, is there anything he could have done that would have kept the country together and created some form of, like, peaceful future?
Well, a lot goes wrong for Buchanan. The expedition against the Mormons um, makes them look weak. The economy falls apart with the Panic of 1857, and then you get the whole mess in Kansas. Um,
Most of it he
well,
didn't have control over, too.
well, but he did have control over Lecompton because okay, when the Pierce administration goes out, Geary has done his job, and Geary has made the pro-slavery people in Kansas detest him. So we get yet another territorial governor, Robert Walker, who
I
is
think
a Northerner.
he's
Is he the short guy?
he was short guy. Yeah, I looked it up.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, when you mentioned, I thought, is that Walker?
Began with a
But
W. Yeah.
okay. But Walker had settled in Mississippi, and Buchanan goes to Walker and says, what they had decided by the time they picked Geary is that they realized we can't send our second raters out to the territory. I mean, territorial governors is where you patronage post for some guy who doesn't matter. And now they know they need somebody good. So Buchanan goes to Walker and he says, I need a man of stature who can handle this. And Walker's like, oh, this is so Walker, he knows this is a thankless job. But he's a patriot and a good Democrat. He's going to help his country. But he wants assurances. And he asks Buchanan, and Walker is going to make sure that the Free Staters are dealt with fairly, and that if there is a constitution, the Free Staters will have a shot at the ratification vote. And Buchanan tells him, yes, absolutely, he will support Walker. So Walker goes in, and the pro-slavery settlers and delegates at Lecompton, there's no way they want this thing submitted for an up and down vote. And just to back up a little bit, the Lecompton Constitutional Convention was elected in 1857, and the Free Staters sat out that election. And so it's all pro-slavery. Free Staters said
thousands and thousands of votes.
Yeah.
Thousands of Missouri votes.
Well, and
and
falsified returns. I mean, the ones that were buried under the woodpile.
Yeah, well, you didn't even need to do that with the Lecompton election of the Constitutional Convention, because the Free Staters had just said they were going to boycott it. They thought it was stacked, the apportionment was stacked against them. Okay, so you've got these delegates, and in Lecompton, they're determined to have a pro-slavery constitution. And Walker is determined that the Free Staters are going to have a say in this. And Buchanan essentially does not back Walker up. And he lets the Lecompton Constitution come forward with this bizarre ratification vote in which you can't really vote to keep slavery out of Kansas. So Walker goes back to DC to argue with the president. So I would say that's one thing that Buchanan did wrong, is he did not stick to his guns with in backing up Walker. Then when the Constitution comes into Congress, Buchanan is desperately trying to find a way to get this pro-slavery Constitution through Congress, and it's just politically the best. Well, they can't even get the Democratic Party to support it. The Northern Democrats won't support this, and this is Douglas's famous break with the president. So the best that they can do is come up with this sort of face-saving English compromise where they vote to send the the Lecompton Constitution back to Kansas for a ratification vote about the land ordinance. I mean, supposedly has the problem with Lecompton has nothing to do with slavery, but they've asked for too much public land, so it has to go back. And at which point we finally get a fair up and down vote on Lecompton. So I would say Buchanan didn't support Walker as he had promised to do, didn't handle Lecompton very well. And that doesn't even get into the problems with him saying, Dred's, the Supreme Court is going to issue a decision that's going to solve all our problems. And just makes everybody madder.
Dred like that.
Yeah. And sending troops out to Utah and then having to sort of back down in a kind of humiliating compromise with the Mormon church.
Well, and then of course Harper's Ferry and all that.
Yeah, and you can't really blame
no.
Buchanan for Harper's Ferry.
No. But I mean, it was part of the.
You're right.
It's part of the equation.
Yeah. Right.
So I'm always struck by one of the things that again and again came up in this conversation, right, in your book, that you have this continuous cheating that is going on in these elections. When in most of the cases, the outcomes these guys wanted didn't require cheating.
Well, yeah, and that's very ironic because that first territorial election, we pretty much think there were more Missourians there than others, that they didn't need to cheat. Yeah. Now, by the time you get into 1857, 1858, yes, they would have needed to cheat. We generally think there are so many more Midwesterners on the ground, in particular, more Free State settlers. And I should point out a number. There's a solid chunk of the Free State Party that are from Missouri. Not all the Missourians wanted to make Kansas a slave state.
Yeah, because you talk about Little Dixie, and then the Border Ruffians. Did they actually call themselves Border Ruffians, or was Border Ruffian a term that was given to them by the Free Staters?
That's the Free Staters. They
Part of the propaganda.
Ruffians. Yeah.
You also wanted to ask something about Jayhawkers, Andrew.
No, I wanted to ask first about squatter sovereignty.
Oh, there you go.
That was the question, because when he and I talked earlier today, and talking about so my thesis, which I'm finishing up, is on Andrew Johnson, and so the Lecompton Constitution comes up because that's when Johnson goes to the Senate, and the debates are hot debate. And one of the issues that one of the linguistic things that I was wondering about is the term squatter sovereignty, because sometimes it's capitalized, sometimes it's not, sometimes it's in quotation marks, sometimes it's not. Was it a derisive term?
Oh, yes.
Okay, so it was okay. So and then all right, that was because that was one thing that I didn't find clear in the opening part of your book, and I wondered. It actually gave me pause, because I thought, if it's not a derisive term, then my understanding is kind of is twisted and backwards.
Yeah, well, of course, squatter, that term goes back to people who came out and colonized on the public lands before, or even, before they've been acquired from the natives. So you were squatting on that land. So it's a derisive nickname for popular sovereignty. Douglas talks about popular sovereignty, talks about non-intervention in the territories, another term for popular sovereignty. But the Republicans, non-Democrats will, say squatter sovereignty, just going out there. It is a way of making fun of this idea of popular sovereignty.
Okay, right.
And I think there's a reference, and I'm trying to remember whether it's Lincoln or somebody else who talks about Douglas having squatted down on squatter sovereignty.
Well, there are a lot of good
Okay.
puns as well. The word play between these people, with these, it's just fantastic.
Mhm.
I like the sound on the goose as the kind of secret handshake.
Yeah, we did a lot of looking into where that phrase comes. Chris Phillips, in one of his books, he said "sound on the goose," and I may have repeated this in my book, that that became known as the goose question because getting Kansas was like getting the Christmas goose. That was a prize that the Missourians had not expected, since that territory was supposed to be free. And then went on later and did more research and kind of come up with the theory that um, goose question was a very common phrase in the 1800s having to do with politics, because geese wandering in the streets was a common civic problem. So if you were a local official, if you were running for city council or something, you might be asked how you were going to vote on the goose question, how you were going to vote on this issue of what to do about all the geese who are running around. I don't know about where you guys live, but in Muncie, we're on a river and we have a goose problem. You will frequently find the traffic is stopped while the geese are going across the road, and you're waiting for them to get across. Um, so goose question and the idea, are you sound on the goose question? Are you supporting the right side on this? Seems to have come out of just sort of 19th century politics. This is a common issue that people have opinions on.
Now, the reason that I know the phrase is
Mhm.
not because of this. It's not because of this, but it's because of Andrew Johnson.
Okay.
In 1859, 1860, he was kind of torn between an Upper South Democrat who Jacksonian in principle, but didn't get along with his Deep South colleagues.
Right.
We got along better with his Western colleagues, like Stephen Douglas. And the question was, is he sound on the goose? And sound on the goose was used in kind of a mocking way of Johnson, because Johnson was in the Senate, a place where he shouldn't have been because he was poor. And the goose was apparently one of the tools used as a tailor.
Oh,
So,
okay. Yeah.
so there was the pun, and it was used repeatedly across the North, at least,
Mm-hmm.
by Democratic papers about Johnson being sound on the goose, Johnson being pro-slavery.
Right. I think it is in Kansas that the goose question becomes associated
Yeah,
specifically with the issue of slavery. Yeah.
yeah. So it's a really interesting to come from birds and geese, the problem, all the way to using that as a pun, talking about an instrument used for by a tailor. Uh, I find that just extraordinary.
Mm-hmm.
So going back for a second, so what was the right answer to the goose question for the local politician?
In about the real geese.
Yes, I want to
Yeah,
know. Is it like
I
the
think
real answer is kill him or
you get rid of them somehow.
okay.
Yeah, because
The
they're a
goose is
nuisance.
you eat them. Goose is great.
Yeah, well, why not?
Yeah, unless they are like somebody's geese that are wandering around
Oh yeah, yeah,
unpenned in. Yeah.
yeah.
If you don't mark them, that's fine.
Oh.
Oh my gosh. Um, but actually, I'm going to piggyback on your question, or kind of part of what you just said, Andrew, with regard to Andrew Johnson being Southern or Western, and that sort of, I guess when you wrote the books, this was not yet a big issue, but it has become a bigger issue of sort of the West, the West with regard to Civil War history, right? Like, I mean, of course, we had James McPherson's book already, that Kansas mattered because, but then like it disappears, right? It kind of goes away, and the West sort of fades as the Civil War kind of takes hold. So how do you see your work as sort of this intersection between Civil War history and Western history?
Well, as you said, the sort of new idea that the West is important to the Civil War. When you mentioned, Andrew, the Three-Cornered War, I was thinking Megan K. Nelson's book
that's what I immediately thought of as
about the
well.
far Southwest, and I thought,
Yeah.
oh no, I don't think I'm going to be able to answer that question.
No.
But so yeah, so we had all of this literature on the West as a theater of the Civil War that's important to the outcome of the Civil War. I believe it's Gary Gallagher who just kind of says, piffle.
Yes.
The Civil War is decided in Virginia, in Georgia, on the coast. And I certainly think the issue of slavery in the territories is a crucial part of bringing on the Civil War. I mean, Kansas is incredibly important, I think, and part of my justification for the book being important is that it's elucidating a part of the story that really contributes to the coming of the Civil War. And if you go out to Lecompton, you can buy T-shirts and say Lecompton, where the Civil War began. And yeah, I'm fine with that. Sure, but let them make that claim. Although I would still go with the firing on Fort Sumter as being the real beginning of the Civil War. But I agree with Gallagher that when you get into how the Civil War is fought and which theaters are important to deciding the war, yes, there's a whole lot of stuff that goes on the Kansas-Missouri border during the war, and that is certainly important in its own right. But I don't think that decides the war. I think Lee and Grant and Sherman and McClellan and all those people are deciding the war. Was one thing I was going to, now Daniel Sutherland in his book on the guerrilla conflict, and which since he wrote that book, that has taken off as a whole new subfield, or maybe not new subfield, but certainly grown. There's a lot more literature on that. And Sutherland starts with Missouri. It's Missouri that sort of dissolves into guerrilla war first. And so that's very important. But I do think that the crucial elements in fighting the Civil War and determining how the Civil War comes out are to the east.
When you say east,
of course Dan had to come up.
Well, but are you saying east as in east of the Mississippi, or east as in east around Washington, Virginia?
Well, east of the Mississippi.
Yeah.
I would say Georgia is important.
Yeah.
The campaigns in Georgia, Mississippi, that's important to the outcome of the war.
Yeah.
Well, as a Dan Sutherland graduate, I appreciate that you put his name in here.
Yeah, it's a great book.
Well, I said mostly through his Whistler stuff when I was there.
Yeah, when he won the Tom Watson Brown Prize, that was actually what he talked about, was James McNeill Whistler. So it was yeah, he said, well, I won for this book on guerrilla war, but I really been working on this. That's what he talked about.
Oh, you gotta love Dan sometimes. But I'm going to push back a little bit, because I think I agree that, of course, Sherman, you can't dismiss certain important battles of the Civil War in the East. But I'm also thinking here in terms of like while the Civil War goes on, we still have a lot of things happening in the West, right?
Yes,
and like
yes.
the whole question of how do you structure territories that Kansas starts, of these processes of violence that are involved in these territorial conflicts that, I mean, you see some in Wyoming eventually, and Montana eventually. struggles of the U.S. Army with frontier questions. I mean, all of that is in Kansas during the times that you're looking at, and that goes on while Kansas and the United States is fighting the war. So I'm kind of like thinking in that terminology too, of like this intersection of like, yes, there's a civil war going on, but there's also things still happening in the West that we kind of sometimes forget about, that they're just kind of pushing the frontier forward is still going on, even though most of the
It
military
is
attention is elsewhere.
certainly, what's going out west is, as I said, it's important in its own right. It's important in Native American history. It's important in the history of that region, but it's not, I think, the determining factor in whether the Union or the Confederacy wins.
On that note, I was just looking. I didn't. I thought that that Kansas was admitted as a state in '62, and it was March of '61, so just before Fort Sumter. So,
Actually, it's January 61.
oh, okay. Well,
Yeah, it's right.
Wikipedia has it wrong.
Aren't we surprised?
They it is when Kansas gets in because of secession. It's because the Southerners aren't there to vote against Kansas admission that they finally get in.
Okay, all right. And then I think it's interesting that Nebraska is '67.
Yes.
Mm.
So,
Yes. And I once did a little bit about what happened. I think I have an article out there somewhere about the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which actually technically is the Nebraska-Kansas Act.
yeah, that's it.
But we always call it Kansas-Nebraska Act. And I looked at Nebraska, and Nebraska, you have Iowans coming over and voting who are not resident in the territory, and that gets no attention. It's not on the scale of what the Missourians do in Kansas Territory, but also it's the case that everyone expected Nebraska to become a free state. So it's when the Iowans come over and vote, that's not a big deal. Yeah, it's this sort of high profile way that the New Englanders say we're going to come in and save Kansas for freedom, and then everybody sort of got there watching what's happening in Kansas, and it's Kansas that really explodes with all these problems.
Quick follow-up on that.
Yeah,
because as you asked this question about Nebraska, and then the Nebraska-Kansas Act comes up, when I was doing my dissertation research long time ago at this stage, I remember I came across an article where it was somebody who works on like German American migration into Nebraska territory, Iowa. And not very scholarly actually, but they made this claim that apparently a newspaper or so tried to convince people that the U.S. capital would be moved to Nebraska to be in the center of the country in the 1850s. Have you ever just come across something like that?
I've heard that.
No, I can remember discussions of that when I was a kid, that, why shouldn't the capital be in,
Right.
and I think they said Kansas, you should be in the middle of the country. And, Rosemarie Zagari did like her very earliest work on the early national period was how they had this idea that state capitals should be in the center of states. And, of course, Washington, D.C. was more or less in the middle, of the colonies, and, came out of the deal that Hamilton and Jefferson and Madison made in the 1790s. Yeah, but I don't know that I've seen too much talk about that in the 19th century.
Well, there was an episode of Last Week Tonight with John Oliver, 7, 8 years ago,
Oh my God.
where
Mhm.
they were talking about states investing in uh, fiber optics and communications, for building up server farms and things like that for internet stuff. And there was a movement apparently to move the kind of the organizational center of the United States, if not the capital, to somewhere like Kansas or it's Kansas or Nebraska or some. It was right in the middle of the country, and they talked
Uh-huh.
about North Dakota being important as well. There was some talent. I don't know. Yeah. So
Yeah, North Dakota isn't exactly central, and really, I don't know if the tourists want to go to North Dakota when it's 40 below.
yeah, it's flat.
I'm not sure you want to go in the summer either. But
Um, I had a question, kind of about terminology, and I think it'll be my last question actually. In Okay, so the title of the book is "Leading Kansas: Contested Liberty in the Civil War Era." What is your take on the term liberty as it goes with Kansas?
Well, Lincoln said we all talk about liberty and we all mean something different. And so the Southerners, white Southerners, meant their freedom to own other people and to take those people as property into the territories. African Americans, and I think this is, one way in which the work by people like Kristen Tegmeyer Ortel and Kristen Epps and Diane Moody Burke, who have all looked at African Americans in Missouri and in Bleeding Kansas, and that has really fleshed out, I think, added on to my work. But you African Americans were looking for the freedom to have self-determination and ownership of themselves. Um, and so you do I do talk about in the book, you have people who are self-liberating by running away into Missouri, and that really grows during the years of the actual Civil War. And in Lawrence becomes a kind of a destination. And this is what David Etcheson, the senator from Missouri, had warned was going to happen. Missouri was surrounded on three sides by free territories or free states. That this would allow enslaved people to seek their liberty. So, and then you get the Northerners, the Free Staters, who I would argue they view liberty in a political lens for themselves. What popular sovereignty was supposed to offer them was the right of free men to vote and decide the questions of importance in American life. And so they feel denied their political liberty when they face these fraudulent elections. And so that is what Charles Robinson is saying on the 4th of July, 1855, after this, big fraudulent election of a pro-slavery territorial legislature. He says the question is not just whether we're going to see slaves in Missouri, but whether we are going to be slaves ourselves. So this idea that by being denied their political rights, northern white men are being politically enslaved to this slave power, capital S, capital P. But I also argue in the book that part of what happens is that as they fight for what they see as their own political rights, their own political liberty, the Free Staters begin to they understand the slave power not just as a threat to African Americans, but as a threat to white Northerners. And they begin to become radicalized on abolition. And the big figure here is not John Brown, who's already a radical. on abolition, who already believes in freeing the enslaved. It's someone like Jim Lane, who is deeply racist and comes into the territory, and even when he is a guerrilla leader in the fighting in 1856, they have an African American who runs away, and Lane sends him back, says, we're not fighting for you, we're fighting for the rights of white men. But then, Lane, when he goes on to become one of Kansas's first senators, will say in the U.S. Senate that it was in Kansas that we learned that Black men could fight, and we learned that the slave power was a threat, that as long as there was slavery, that this was a threat to white people as well. And he becomes a recruiter, perhaps impressing as much as he recruited, helping to raise Kansas's Black regiment well before the State Department is prepared for that. So a lot of the Free Staters come to see the African American definition of freedom as dovetailing with preserving political liberties for everyone.
I actually like that because it's so squared with my own book. So I'm going to ask the final question then, unless Andrew does his usual thing.
I'm done.
He says that, but then you'd be surprised. So you guys like follow up and follow up and follow up and follow up, and we sit here another half hour. But I think it was Randall Woods when I was in the PhD program. He kind of made this comment that to study history is a great thing, because when things in our time in the modern go wrong, there's this escapes that we can go to and kind of escape from the reality and kind of ignore what's going on around us. But I want to turn that on its head for you, and kind of, because Bleeding Kansas is a really interesting situation, because you have your two sides that are clashing. They're armed, they're fighting each other, even though the Free Soilers don't really want to fight, but they are ready to fight when it comes to
chopping people up with swords and hatchets.
Yes, John Brown, right? Like, and in many ways, as we pull our head back from our Civil War escape into the modern, and we kind of remember what you wrote about Kansas, Nebraska, what are the lessons that we can draw from that for our own time right now, in which we're, and well, Andrew and I is the exception, you are less so, but you're in a country that is on a brink, that is on a watershed moment. So what kind of lessons do we draw from that to our modern time?
Well, I will say, I've been teaching Civil War for 30 years, and I usually begin by asking the students why they're taking the class. And I always tell them it's perfectly fine if they say it fit my schedule, because sometimes it's just like I need these credits, and but usually Civil War, you get people who want to be in the class. And for 20 some of those years, I've generally gotten, my dad took me to all the battlefields, and I've always been really interested in this.
Yes.
Or my boyfriend is really into Civil War, and I need to know what he's talking about. And then in 2016, I started getting, and I've been getting it ever since, I think the country is on the brink of another civil war, and I want to understand what happened the first time. So yes, Americans have, at least in the little anecdotal sample that I have, we have a very profound sense that something's gone wrong in our political world, and people are seeking to understand that. I have actually started to believe, and sometimes suggested to the students, that in some ways it seems to me we're in the politics of the 70s, 90s, in the sense that you had the Federalists and the Jeffersonians who fundamentally did not believe the other side was legitimate. You know, the Jeffersonians are the French revolutionaries. And in both sides, like, you're trying to subvert the Constitution. The federal Jeffersonians say you're trying to make it too monarchical. The Federalists say you're trying to have a French Revolution. And so the watershed moment, as you guys may teach in your classes, is the election of 1800, when you get the first peaceful transfer, the first transfer from one party to another, and it's peaceful, and that's really, really important. So in some ways, when I look at our current moment, I think of the 1790s. Also, we may remember in 2016, in his first term, Mr. Trump self-identified very much with Andrew Jackson. And I had a conversation with an Uber driver who was driving me to the archives in a big city where I did not live, and found out I was a historian. And he went, "So what do you think? You know, you think President Trump is like Andrew Jackson?" And so I struggled with that question.
That's a hard question.
Well, you know, I actually feel like this beginning of this second term is really Jacksonian. In the sense of, and partly I'm teaching the survey this semester, I'm reading the textbook chapter on Jackson. It's talking about the mob that comes to the White House. And these aren't the establishment figures, and he fires the cabinet, and he's got these unofficial advisors, and everything seems really chaotic. And I'm like, yeah, I think there are some parallels there. I don't know that we should overstate the parallels. So what are the Bleeding Kansas parallels? Well, back again during Mr. Trump's first administration, David Blight held a conference at Yale and invited a bunch of people to come and compare the 1850s to the current day. Kind of this, are we in the prelude to a new civil war kind of theme. And one funny thing that I noticed, you know, Richard Blackett was there from Vanderbilt, and, you know, people were listed by, you know, us historians, we were listed by our university. On the initial draft of the program, I was the only person where it said my name, my institution, and the town. And I may be reading too much of this, but it was kind of like, well, who the hell's ever heard of that? Where is that? So it's like Ball State, Muncie, Indiana. It's like everybody else, we've heard of it. So as a Midwesterner going to, you know, one of the coasts, I'm like, oh, they don't know anything about the interior, so they've got to identify this. And I don't know if that's the case or not. But the other thing was, as Blight himself mentioned to me, I was apparently the only person who tried to grapple with the question. People's expertise was the fugitive slave law. They talked about the fugitive slave law. They didn't try to relate it to today. I did. And I will probably never eat lunch in New Haven, Connecticut again. Because I tried to give, you know, the perspective from both the Trump side and the Clinton side. And I that didn't seem to go over very well. But I mean, but falling back on my memory of that is, you have a lot of the same issues. The issues we've already talked about, fraud and elections and so on. And I think one of the lessons out of the book that became kind of pertinent with the 2000 election and following is that the processes, the registering to vote, the casting of the ballot, how the ballot is counted, all of that matters. And we took that for granted all of my life up until the year 2000. And now we understand that those processes are really important, that democracy with a small d is not self-executing. It has to work through these processes, and you have to make sure that the processes are fair. It is, I think, another thing that I would argue based on Bleeding Kansas is democracy with a small d has a very, very hard time resolving essentially moral questions. You can be Stephen Douglas and you can say, I don't care which way you vote about slavery. But John Brown cares. I mean, this is essentially a moral, and there are lots of people who cared. And if you got a majority that said slavery was okay, that did not make it okay. So there's certain kinds of questions, and Lincoln says this when he says in his debates with Douglas, we're not talking about the cranberry laws, about regulating how we grow cranberries. We're talking about something that is a fundamentally moral issue. And although Lincoln is willing to abide by the constitutional settlement, he always says this is a different kind of an issue, and it has always been treated differently. The founders treated it differently, and popular sovereignty is fundamentally popular sovereignty is saying something is okay that is fundamentally at odds with our political values. And so I guess the final thing that I would say is that liberty is a fundamental American value. They were quarreling in the 1850s about what constituted liberty and how to gain it for themselves. And I think that is true of our ideological debate today. On the one hand, and I may frame this ineptly, but you have, I think, Trump supporters who feel that their liberty has been trampled on. We currently, nationally, Mr. Trump has declared we're not going to have DEI. The governor of Indiana is doing the same thing. And I think that, reflects the feeling people have and have had for a long time that they're going to be called out for sort of innocuous arguments, or they're going to have a policy position on taxes or something and be accused of being racist. So people feel that their kind of liberty has been infringed by government sort of policing their speech. And on the other hand, you have people who are genuinely worried about, does this take us back to this age when it was okay to discriminate against women, against people of color? So I don't know that I've articulated it well, but I think we still have, arguments about what freedom means and how we're enacting it, that we've been having as long as the United States has been around.
Yeah, no, and I will say that if no one buys you a lunch in New Haven, that's okay. Because I think your views are way better in helping solve the problem than the ones in New Haven then.
Yeah, and it's very it's really discouraging. I would just say one of my formative memories, my mother and her favorite sister were totally opposite politically. And they would sit at the dining room table and they would argue about things. And at a certain point where they were going to lose their temper at their sibling, one of them would say, "I need a cup of coffee." And that was the signal to
Right.
halt the discussion, cool off, and come back later. And my son and I do that now. We're at opposite views, and our safe word is how are the Colts doing? It's say it's time to talk about football, talk about something else. And he tells me that none of his friends talk politics with their parents. And I find that really sad.
No, but it's sort of one of those things that I always find sad, and that both applies to German politics as well as US politics, that it's very easy sometimes for us academically minded individuals to lecture people who vote for the other side and be like, and that's not helpful, right? That only belittles people on the other side and makes them feel even more like being discriminated against. And I find it very sad that happens so often.
Yes, and as you know, in the United States, there's been this sort of, and this is part of, I think, Mr. Trump's appeal, the attack on the elites, right. And the assertion that the elites look down on people who are outside of academia or outside certain professions, and I would argue that, as you said, that a lot of academics do look down on people who don't have the same education that we have. And it's like, why don't you think like I do? Well, we're in different worlds. We're having different experiences.
And we turn philosophical there. Any last follow-up, Andrew?
No, and I'm on the verge of coughing. I think a huge coughing fit.
All right, then I will do the thank you. Well, thank you, Nicole.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
It was wonderful.
Thank you, Nicole. It was a really interesting discussion. Really,
yes, I know it's much later there. It's gotten dark outside your window, Andrew.
So. Well, but I should feel lucky because it's been dark since 2:00 in the afternoon for him.
It's getting more to like 5 or 6 now.
Really? Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you very much for having me.
Thank you.
It's been a great honor.
You're gonna